Before there were flags, before there were borders, there were crowns, and two kings who claimed the same destiny. This is not just the story of battles and bloodlines. It is the story of a century that refused to end, a time when pride became prayer, when faith was tested by fire, and when out of ashes, nations were born. From the thunder of Crécy to the fire of Rouen, from the black banners of plague to the white banner of a girl who heard the voice of heaven. This is the war that changed everything. For 100 years, England and France clashed not only for power, but for identity itself. Kings rose, empires crumbled, and an illiterate peasant girl became the voice of God. The Middle Ages ended here, in steel, smoke, and faith. The 100 Years' War was more than a conflict. It was the crucible where modern Europe was forged, where the age of knights gave way to the age of nations, and the language of conquest turned into the language of memory. And now, through light and sound, through story and soul, we will walk that century together. Welcome to History Teller YT, where time breathes again. This is the 100 Years' War, a tale of ambition, faith, and the rebirth of the world. In the early 14th century, Europe was a continent of dynastic ambition and fragile alliances. Monarchs across the land married, betrayed, and warred with one another to expand influence and wealth. Among them stood two powerful kingdoms, England and France, bound by blood, trade, and rivalry. The English kings of the Plantagenet dynasty controlled vast territories not only in England, but also across western France, such as Aquitaine, Gascony, and Poitou. These lands were relics of the feudal past, when English rulers held them as vassals to the French crown. It was a system born of medieval complexity, a king who owed fealty to another king. However, as the centuries passed, this arrangement became increasingly untenable. English monarchs like Edward I and Edward II saw themselves as equals, not vassals, to the French kings. Meanwhile, France under the Capetian dynasty sought to reassert control over every inch of its territory. When Philip IV of France died in 1314, his heir succession crisis opened a dangerous door. The French nobility invoked Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line, to exclude Edward III of England, the grandson of Philip IV through his mother, Isabella of France, from claiming the French throne. Instead, they crowned Philip VI of Valois in 1328, a distant cousin, to Edward. This was both a personal insult and a challenge to his legitimacy. He believed that his royal blood gave him a stronger claim than Philip's. Though initially reluctant to press the matter, tension simmered as both nations competed for control of the lucrative wool trade, Flemish loyalty, and maritime dominance. Europe was set on a collision course, and the 100 Years' War was about to ignite. The 1330s were marked by uneasy diplomacy, shifting alliances, and economic warfare. The English economy depended heavily on exporting raw wool to the textile mills of Flanders, a region under nominal French control. When Philip VI supported anti-English uprisings in Flanders, Edward III retaliated by imposing trade bans and seeking Flemish allies who favored English independence from French dominance. Meanwhile, France's growing naval power posed a new threat. French privateers raided English coastal towns, burning ships and villages from the Cinque Ports to Southampton. Edward's merchants demanded revenge, and nobles eager for glory urged the young king to take up arms. In 1337, Philip VI made a fateful move. He confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, declaring Edward a rebellious vassal. This act struck at England's pride and economy simultaneously. Edward III's response was bold. He formally claimed the French crown, declaring himself king of France by right of his mother's lineage. It was not merely a declaration of ambition. It was a declaration of total war. The continent trembled at the news. The Pope tried to mediate, but both kings were already preparing their fleets and knights. Behind the banners and heraldry, however, lay a more profound transformation. The conflict would not just be about dynastic claims. It would redefine national identity. For the first time, ordinary people in England and France began to see themselves not only as subjects of a ruler, but as members of a nation, Englishmen and Frenchmen, whose loyalty and destiny were tied to their homeland's fate. The declaration of war in 1337 was not greeted with shock, but with grim determination. Medieval Europe had seen countless wars, yet this one would be unlike any before. Both England and France believed they fought under divine favor. Priests blessed the armies. Chroniclers sharpened their quills. Across the Channel, fleets were built, taxes raised, and alliances forged in secret. Edward III secured support from the Holy Roman Emperor, various Low Country states, and even naval mercenaries from Genoa. France, richer and more populous, boasted an army that dwarfed England's in size, but lacked unity among its nobles. The war's first phase, the Edwardian phase, began with raids along the French coast, naval skirmishes, and sieges that would stretch over decades. Yet beneath the political maneuvers, a deeper story unfolded, one of shifting technology and the decline of chivalric warfare. England's longbowmen, drawn from yeoman farmers, would soon prove deadlier than any armored knight. The war would not only test kings, but also redefine the nature of power, courage, and leadership. The stage was set for a century of blood, betrayal, and transformation. As 1337 gave way to 1338, both crowns prayed for victory, but neither could imagine that their quarrel would last 116 years, reshape Europe's map, and give birth to legends like Joan of Arc. As the banners of war unfurled across England and France, both monarchs moved quickly to gather allies and fortify their ambitions. For King Edward III of England, the war was more than a dynastic dispute. It was an opportunity to prove himself a warrior king in the tradition of his ancestor, Richard the Lionheart. In 1337, he called upon his nobles, urging them to rally behind him against what he described as French arrogance and betrayal. His court became a place of restless preparation. Blacksmiths forged swords and armor day and night. Archers practiced in village greens, and fleets were assembled in the ports of Southampton and Portsmouth. On the other side, King Philip VI of France answered the challenge with equal fervor. France was, by all measures, the stronger nation, larger in population, wealthier in resources, and blessed with a chivalric nobility eager for glory. Philip commanded loyalty from great feudal houses, the Burgundians, the Bretons, the Normans, and drew upon his kingdom's deep coffers to finance the coming storm. But unity among the French lords was fragile, often torn apart by jealousy and pride. The early years saw skirmishes along the coast and raids in Gascony. French ships attacked English trade routes, seizing merchant vessels and torching ports like Portsmouth. Edward retaliated with devastating raids along the Normandy coast. These were not yet grand battles, but they foreshadowed a brutal war that would engulf generations. Across Europe, chroniclers began referring to the conflict as the Quarrel of the Two Crowns, unaware that it would endure longer than any war in medieval memory. By 1338, the English Parliament had granted Edward extraordinary taxes to fund his campaign, and he secured alliances with the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV. France, in turn, courted the Scots, hoping to open a second front against England. Europe was dividing into camps, and the medieval order was slowly shifting into an era where warfare was no longer a noble's pastime, but a national struggle. The first major clash came not on land, but at sea. In June 1340, the English and French fleets met off the coast of Sluis, near modern-day Belgium. It was a defining moment, for whoever controlled the channel controlled the war. The French Navy, confident in their superior numbers, positioned themselves in a defensive line across the narrow waters. Their ships were lashed together in tight formation, creating a floating fortress bristling with archers and crossbowmen. Edward III, sailing with his men aboard the Thomas of Winchelsea, studied the French line. Against the advice of cautious counselors, he decided to attack head-on. At dawn, the English fleet advanced with the wind behind them. The sun glinted off steel and canvas as Edward's men launched volleys of arrows from their longbows, fast, deadly, and devastatingly accurate. The French crossbowmen tried to respond, but their slower reloads proved fatal. The English ships, maneuvering with greater agility, crashed into the French line and unleashed brutal boarding actions. The fighting raged for hours, with ships locked together in desperate combat. The sea ran red as knights and sailors fell into the waves, weighed down by their armor. By sunset, the French fleet lay shattered, over 180 ships destroyed or captured. Chroniclers claimed that the sea seemed one great plain of corpses. The Battle of Sluis was an overwhelming English victory, securing dominance of the Channel and giving Edward free passage to the continent. The triumph transformed Edward's image from ambitious claimant to heroic conqueror. Songs were sung of his bravery. The people hailed him as the new Alexander. But Sluis also revealed the new face of warfare. No longer would gallant knights determine fate through single combat. Discipline, strategy, and technology would now rule the battlefield. England's mastery of the longbow and naval tactics signaled the dawn of a new military age. Yet, even as England celebrated, Philip VI refused to yield. He strengthened his alliances, rebuilt his armies, and prepared for a decisive confrontation on land. The French crown still held the advantage of manpower and resources, and Philip was determined to crush the English before they gained a foothold on his soil. After Sluis, Edward III faced challenges that tested even his resolve. His continental allies demanded payment, and English coffers were drained. The war dragged on through sieges in Flanders and Gascony, but the long-awaited invasion of France did not occur until 1346. That summer, Edward landed in Normandy with an army of about 15,000 men, a mix of knights, men-at-arms, and his now famous longbowmen. The English advanced with devastating speed, sacking towns and fortresses as they went. Edward's campaign was not just military, it was psychological. He wanted to humiliate the French monarchy by showing that their own soil was vulnerable. His troops marched through Caen, looting the city and seizing vast riches. Panic spread across northern France as Philip VI gathered a massive army, determined to annihilate the invaders. On August 26, 1346, the two forces met near the small village of Crécy in Poitiers. The French army, perhaps 3 times the size of Edward's, believed victory was inevitable. Heavy cavalry glittered under the summer sun, their banners fluttering in the wind. The English, positioned on a gentle slope, waited in disciplined silence. Edward had chosen his ground perfectly. He placed his archers in a crescent formation, with wooden stakes before them to repel charges. As the French advanced, the English longbows sang, a deadly hailstorm of arrows that tore through armor and flesh alike. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by Philip, were slaughtered before they could even reload. French knights charged repeatedly, their horses collapsing under arrow fire. Chaos consumed the battlefield as waves of cavalry smashed against English lines, only to be repelled again and again. By nightfall, the field was carpeted with corpses, among them the flower of French nobility. Crécy was a catastrophe for France and a triumph for Edward. For the first time, disciplined infantry and ranged weapons had destroyed the myth of knightly invincibility. The world had changed. Edward's victory opened the path to the siege of Calais, which would soon become England's gateway to continental power for more than 2 centuries. The thunder of Crécy had barely faded when King Edward III turned his eyes to the next prize, Calais, the jewel of the French Channel coast. A fortified city of immense strategic value, Calais was a lifeline between England and the continent. If captured, it would give the English a permanent base from which to launch future campaigns. Edward knew that taking it would require not mere courage but endurance. Thus began one of the most famous sieges in medieval history, a struggle that would last nearly a year, testing the will of soldiers and civilians alike. In September 1346, Edward's army surrounded Calais by land and sea, cutting off all supplies. The French garrison, commanded by Jean de Vienne, vowed to resist to the last breath. Behind the walls, nearly 20,000 inhabitants faced starvation. For months, they held out against bombardments and repeated assaults. Edward constructed massive siege engines, trebuchets that hurled stones and fire, shattering towers and gates. The English navy patrolled the coast, ensuring no relief could arrive. Even so, Philip VI tried desperately to lift the siege. In July 1347, he gathered a relief army and approached the city, but his forces, weary and disorganized, could not break the English blockade. Inside Calais, famine reached horrifying levels. Chroniclers tell of people eating dogs, cats, and even leather to survive. When surrender finally came in August 1347, Edward demanded that the city's leaders come before him in chains, barefoot, wearing only their shirts with ropes around their necks, a symbol of total submission. 6 citizens, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, offered themselves as sacrifices to save the rest. But in a moment of mercy, Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward's wife, pleaded for their lives, and the king spared them. Calais fell, and with it, France lost a vital artery. Edward expelled most of its French inhabitants, repopulating the city with English settlers. For over 2 centuries, Calais would remain an English stronghold, the brightest jewel in England's crown. The victory solidified Edward's reputation as one of Europe's greatest monarchs. Yet behind the triumph, darkness loomed. As his army celebrated, an unseen terror began its march across Europe. The Black Death, a pestilence that would soon devour millions. In 1347, the same year Calais fell, death arrived in Europe not with swords or arrows, but with rats and fleas. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, spread from Asia through the trade routes, carried by merchant ships into Mediterranean ports, and from there into every corner of Europe. By 1348, it had reached England and France, spreading faster than any army. Villages emptied, fields lay untended, and cities became graveyards. The plague killed rich and poor alike, knights and peasants, priests and kings. Chroniclers wrote that parents fled from their children and children from their dying parents. The social fabric of medieval life collapsed. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Trade halted. Labor shortages upended feudal systems as surviving peasants demanded higher wages. In some regions, up to half the population perished. England and France, already exhausted by years of war, now faced devastation beyond imagination. For Edward III, the plague was both curse and opportunity. His armies were reduced in number, but his enemies suffered equally. The French countryside lay desolate, unable to support large forces. Warfare slowed for several years as both kingdoms mourned their dead. Yet the trauma of the plague changed the psychology of the age. Men who had stared into death's abyss returned hardened, fatalistic, and fearless. The concept of divine punishment became intertwined with the idea of national destiny, the belief that survival itself was proof of God's favor. When the plague's fury subsided by the early 1350s, the war resumed with renewed ferocity. Edward's eldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, emerged as a formidable leader. Tall, charismatic, and ruthless, he was a symbol of English chivalry reborn. He wore black armor emblazoned with the royal arms of England and France, signifying his father's claim to both thrones. Under his command, England would soon deliver another crushing blow to France, one that would humble kings and shake the world. In the year 1356, France sought revenge for Crécy and Calais. The French king, John II, known as John the Good, assembled one of the largest armies of the century, over 40,000 men, determined to crush the English invaders once and for all. Meanwhile, the Black Prince led a smaller force, no more than 7,000 soldiers, on a daring raid through southwestern France, burning towns and capturing supplies. His campaign, known as a chevauchée, aimed to terrorize the countryside and weaken French morale. As the French army closed in, the Black Prince tried to retreat toward Bordeaux, but near the town of Poitiers, the French blocked his path. A battle was inevitable. On September 19th, 1356, the morning sun rose over a foggy field where destiny awaited. The English, vastly outnumbered, took up a defensive position on a ridge flanked by hedges and vineyards. Their longbowmen lined the slopes, their arrows ready. The French knights, confident of victory, charged again and again, and met the same fate as at Crécy. The air filled with the hiss of arrows and the cries of horses. English archers loosed wave after wave, cutting down knights before they could reach the line. The French vanguard broke, and confusion spread. The Black Prince, cool under pressure, ordered a counterattack that shattered the enemy's resolve. Amid the chaos, King John II fought bravely, but was surrounded and captured. His banner fell, and France's army crumbled. The aftermath was a humiliation unlike any in French history. The King of France was now a prisoner in English hands, a living trophy. Taken to London, John was treated honorably, but held for ransom. His captivity, a symbol of France's broken pride. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 confirmed Edward's territorial gains, granting him vast lands in exchange for John's freedom. For a brief moment, it seemed that England had won not just battles, but the very crown of France. Yet victory bred overconfidence. The English realm, stretched thin by war and plague, would soon face its own trials. Rebellion, loss, and the rise of a French heroine whose faith would turn despair into destiny. After the thunder of Poitiers faded, Europe found itself staring into the uneasy calm of peace. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, marked the zenith of English power in France. By this agreement, Edward III renounced his claim to the French crown, but gained sovereignty over vast territories in the southwest, including Aquitaine, Poitou, Saintonge, and Calais, effectively 1/3 of France. In return, King John II of France, still a captive in London, was promised freedom upon paying a staggering ransom of 3 million gold écus. At first glance, it seemed an English triumph. Edward's dream of empire appeared fulfilled. In the ports of London and Bordeaux, merchants toasted the king, and songs celebrated the victories of Crécy and Poitiers. Yet beneath the surface, the peace was fragile, stitched together by exhaustion rather than reconciliation. France was devastated, its fields burnt, its treasury drained, and its villages haunted by famine and plague. But it was also unbowed. French pride still burned beneath the ashes, and many nobles refused to accept English rule. The ransom proved crippling. To raise funds, France imposed heavy taxes that drove peasants into despair. In some regions, law and order collapsed entirely, giving rise to ruthless mercenary bands known as routiers. These soldiers, left jobless after the treaty, roamed the countryside looting towns and ransoming villagers. The land became a wilderness of fear. Even worse, King John II, though released after partial payment, voluntarily returned to English captivity in 1364 when his son failed to honor the ransom terms. A gesture of medieval chivalry that stunned Europe but did little to heal his nation's wounds. As France struggled, Edward III's glory began to fade. Time, disease, and political division crept into his once mighty realm. His sons quarreled for influence, his treasury dwindled, and his subjects grew weary of endless taxation. Across the Channel, France began to find new strength under a young and intelligent prince. Charles, the son of John II, destined to reign as Charles V the Wise. He would become the architect of France's resurgence. When Charles V ascended the throne in 1364, France was still bleeding from decades of war and humiliation. Yet this soft-spoken, bookish monarch would prove more formidable than the warrior kings who preceded him. Unlike Edward III or his own father John II, Charles understood that victory would not come through brute force, but through patience, diplomacy, and intelligent reform. Charles began by restoring stability at home. He reformed the currency, curbed corruption, and reorganized the army. He dismissed reckless nobles who sought glory in reckless charges and instead relied on professionals. Disciplined commanders and tacticians who valued strategy over spectacle. The most famous among them was Bertrand du Guesclin, a rugged Breton knight who became the backbone of Charles's military revival. Du Guesclin, known as the Eagle of Brittany, fought not with flamboyant valor, but with cunning and endurance, reclaiming one fortress after another through siege, ambush, and attrition. Charles also understood the power of information. He commissioned translations of classical works, founded libraries, and used propaganda to rekindle French identity. While English kings taxed their weary people for foreign conquests, Charles spoke to his subjects of justice, faith, and national renewal. Under his reign, France began to see itself as more than a collection of fiefs. It became an idea, a nation worth saving. The tide began to turn. Between 1369 and 1375, French forces, led by Du Guesclin, gradually retook much of the territory lost at Bretigny. English garrisons, isolated and underpaid, surrendered or fled. The once invincible English army began to falter. Even the Black Prince, now governing Aquitaine, found his rule crumbling. Ill and burdened by disease, he imposed harsh taxes that provoked rebellion among the Gascons. The brilliance of his earlier campaigns dimmed as illness consumed him. By the late 1370s, English power in France was visibly waning. The dream of empire was slipping away, undone not by glorious battles, but by quiet strategy, patience, and the resilience of a nation rediscovering itself. As France revived under Charles V, England entered a slow, painful decline. Edward III, once hailed as the Lion of England, grew old and weary. His court, once vibrant with warriors and poets, fell into intrigue and corruption. His beloved son, Edward the Black Prince, returned home from Gascony sick and broken, dying in 1376, 1 year before his father. The death of the prince was a national tragedy. He had been England's hope, its embodiment of chivalry and strength. Chroniclers wrote that the king wept as only a father and a king could weep, for his son and for his glory. The final years of Edward's reign were marked by confusion. His ministers enriched themselves while soldiers went unpaid. Parliament grew restless, demanding reforms. England's once unstoppable armies were now defensive and scattered. In 1377, the old king passed away at the age of 64, leaving behind a fractured legacy, triumph and decay intertwined. His 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, inherited the throne, a boy king born into uncertainty. Meanwhile, in France, Charles V continued to consolidate his success. He avoided reckless confrontation, preferring diplomacy and attrition. When he died in 1380, he left a France stronger, more centralized, and spiritually renewed. His reign marked the end of England's early dominance and the dawn of France's slow but irreversible comeback. Yet even in victory, France faced new turmoil. The death of Charles unleashed factional rivalries among nobles and the dangerous ambitions of his brother, Philip the Bold of Burgundy. The seeds of internal division were planted, seeds that would later threaten to destroy France from within. Across the Channel, the young Richard II would soon confront rebellion at home and weakness abroad. The war, far from over, was merely shifting form. As the 14th century neared its end, both kingdoms stood on the edge of transformation. The next generation would witness not only kings and knights, but peasants, prophets, and saints shaping the fate of nations. Among them would rise a simple peasant girl whose visions would ignite a flame that neither crown nor sword could extinguish, Joan of Arc. When Edward III died in 1377, the English crown passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, the son of the late Black Prince. The boy king inherited a realm that glittered with victories past, but rotted beneath the surface. England's glory days were over. Corruption and exhaustion now ruled where valor once did. Taxes, raised endlessly to fund wars in France, had burdened the common folk beyond endurance. Within 2 years of Richard's coronation, resentment erupted into one of the most shocking uprisings of medieval Europe, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by men like Wat Tyler and the fiery preacher John Ball, tens of thousands of peasants marched on London, demanding justice, equality before God, and an end to the crushing poll tax. They stormed the city, killing officials, burning mansions, and even breaking into the Tower of London. For a moment, it seemed that the entire social order would collapse. Richard, only 14 at the time, showed remarkable courage. He rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, promising reforms and mercy. But once the revolt's leaders were killed, Wat Tyler cut down by the Lord Mayor, the promises vanished like smoke. Retribution followed swiftly. Villages were punished, leaders executed, and the dream of freedom was drowned in blood. The revolt revealed the deep fractures in English society. The chivalric ideals that had inspired Edward's generation were gone. New forces, class tension, disillusionment, and political intrigue were taking their place. Richard grew into a proud and sensitive ruler, more poet than soldier. He surrounded himself with courtiers and artists, favoring beauty and ceremony over war and discipline. Yet beneath his elegant exterior lay insecurity and suspicion. He believed utterly in the divine right of kings, that to oppose him was to oppose God. By the 1390s, Richard's autocratic rule provoked powerful nobles, especially his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. In 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry seized the throne with stunning speed, declaring himself King Henry IV. The once glorious Richard II was captured, imprisoned, and quietly murdered in the Tower. The Plantagenet line, which had ruled for over 2 centuries, was now split in two: Lancastrians and Yorkists, whose rivalry would one day plunge England into civil war. But for now, Henry IV had more immediate concerns: rebellion at home and renewed war with France abroad. While England tore itself apart with politics, France faced horrors of a different kind. After the death of Charles V the Wise, his son Charles VI ascended the throne in 1380, a boy of 12, surrounded by scheming uncles who hungered for power. For a time, his reign promised hope. The young king was handsome, brave, and adored by the people. But in 1392, tragedy struck that would change the destiny of France forever. During a military expedition, Charles suddenly fell into a violent frenzy, attacking his own knights and killing several with his sword. He collapsed soon after, trembling and incoherent. What began as a single episode became a recurring nightmare. The King of France had gone mad. At times, he believed he was made of glass. At others, he forgot his name, his wife, even that he was king. His madness shattered the fragile unity that his father had built. Power slipped into the hands of rival factions. On one side, the Armagnacs, loyal to the king's brother Louis of Orleans. On the other, the Burgundians, led by the cunning and ambitious John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The kingdom descended into civil war, with cities switching allegiance and blood flowing through the streets of Paris. The French nobility, instead of uniting against England, devoured each other in endless intrigue. Meanwhile, the common people suffered horribly. Bandits ravaged the countryside, trade collapsed, and the church itself was split by the Great Schism, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon. In this chaos, France's enemies watched and waited. Across the Channel, the new English king Henry IV saw opportunity, but lacked the strength to act. His reign was troubled by rebellions from the Welsh hero, Owain Glynwr, and the powerful northern lords. Yet his son, Prince Henry, would grow up amid this turmoil. A prince who would one day restore England's honor and strike at the heart of a divided France. When Henry IV died in 1413, the crown passed to his 25-year-old son, Henry V, one of the most remarkable monarchs in English history. As a young man, Henry had known both rebellion and disgrace. He had fought in the Welsh wars and even against his own father's enemies. But his youth was marked by reckless ambition and courtly scandal. When he became king, however, Henry transformed overnight. Gone was the impulsive prince. In his place stood a disciplined, devout, and commanding ruler determined to unite England and revive its fading glory. Henry's first mission was domestic. He restored stability by reconciling the feuding nobles, reforming the royal administration, and presenting himself as a king of justice and unity. But his gaze soon turned outward. He believed that war in France would not only reclaim his ancestors' lost lands, but also heal England's internal divisions. The opportunity came easily. France, still fractured by the madness of Charles VI and the feud between Burgundians and Armagnacs, was defenseless against invasion. In 1415, Henry demanded recognition of his claim to the French throne, a demand France scornfully rejected. That summer, he sailed from Southampton with a mighty army, landing in Normandy. The campaign was brutal. After besieging Harfleur, disease ravaged his men, and he was forced to retreat toward Calais. But at a muddy field near Agincourt, fate intervened. There, on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, Henry's weary force of barely 6,000 faced a French army 5 times larger. What followed would become legend. The Battle of Agincourt, where English courage and longbows again humbled France's proud knights. Henry's victory at Agincourt would make him immortal, reviving the dream of English dominance in France. The tide had turned once more, and the road to the Treaty of Troyes and Henry's marriage to a French princess lay ahead. Yet the glory would come at a cost, and the fire that burned so brightly in Henry's reign would soon give way to the tragedy of his untimely death and the rise of a peasant girl whose visions would change everything, Joan of Arc. On the damp morning of October 25th, 1415, the fields near a small French village named Agincourt became the stage for one of history's most extraordinary victories. King Henry V of England, commanding an exhausted and disease-stricken army of roughly 6,000 men, faced a French host estimated between 25,000 and 30,000. Mud and rain had turned the ground into a quagmire, but Henry's spirit burned with iron resolve. Before dawn, he knelt and prayed, invoking divine justice for his cause. The English were cornered, sick, starving, and outnumbered 5-1. Yet their discipline and technology would soon turn desperation into destiny. The French, proud and confident, believed victory was inevitable. They were heavily armored knights, nobles of ancient lineage, gleaming in polished steel beneath banners of blue and gold. They mocked the weary English lines and waited impatiently for combat. But Henry chose his position wisely, a narrow, freshly plowed field flanked by woods. The terrain funneled the French into a deadly corridor. As the sun broke through the mist, Henry's archers, thousands of longbowmen, planted sharpened stakes into the muddy ground and waited in eerie silence. When the French advanced, their cavalry charged headlong into the mire. The longbows sang. Tens of thousands of arrows darkened the sky, hissing down like a rain of iron. Horses panicked, knights fell, and the battlefield turned to chaos. The narrow field became a trap, packed with armored men sinking into the mud, trampled by their own comrades. English men-at-arms waded into the slaughter, fighting hand to hand. Hours later, the flower of French nobility lay dead or captured. Among the fallen were dukes, counts, and banner lords. The pride of France annihilated in a single morning. The French casualties were staggering, over 7,000 dead, while English losses were scarcely a few hundred. It was a miracle of discipline and terrain, of leadership and faith. As the sun set, Henry ordered a solemn thanksgiving. Non nobis Domini, his men sang, not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory. The Battle of Agincourt instantly elevated Henry V to legendary status. Europe hailed him as a new Alexander, a warrior favored by God. For England, the victory rekindled pride and unity. For France, it was another wound in a century of humiliation. Yet the war was far from over. Henry intended to press his advantage, not through plunder, but through conquest. After Agincourt, Henry returned briefly to England in triumph, greeted as the savior of his nation. But his ambitions stretched beyond glory. He sought a permanent English realm in France. In 1417, he launched a second, grander invasion with over 10,000 soldiers, beginning a systematic campaign to conquer Normandy, the ancient duchy once held by his Norman ancestors. Unlike earlier kings who relied on raids, Henry brought order and administration. His vision was not merely to defeat France, but to rule it. The English army advanced with relentless precision. Town after town fell. Caen, Al-Assa, Falaise, and Argentan, each fortified, each defended with desperation. Henry imposed strict discipline on his troops. Looting was forbidden, civilians were to be spared, and justice was swift. His leadership inspired loyalty even among his enemies. Chroniclers wrote that he ruled the sword with the mind of a clerk and the heart of a priest. By 1419, after a grueling siege lasting nearly 6 months, the great city of Rouen, the capital of Normandy, finally surrendered. The fall of Rouen was devastating for France. It was not merely a military victory, it was a symbol. The cradle of the Norman kings, once lost, was now back in English hands. Henry entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a sovereign, hearing petitions, granting pardons, and restoring law. French peasants and merchants alike recognized in him a ruler of rare justice, if not mercy. Meanwhile, France continued to crumble under the madness of King Charles VI and the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. In 1419, the feud reached a shocking climax when John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was assassinated during a supposed peace meeting with the Dauphin, the French heir. The murder drove Burgundy into alliance with England. Henry seized the moment with cold calculation. France was dying, divided and leaderless, and in that vacuum, Henry saw the ultimate prize within reach. Not merely victory, but the crown of France itself. In the spring of 1420, Henry V entered the city of Troyes in northern France not as an invader, but as a savior. The French court, dominated by the Burgundian faction and the broken king Charles VI, welcomed him as an ally. After months of negotiation, a treaty was signed that would shake the very foundations of Christendom, the Treaty of Troyes. By this unprecedented accord, Henry V was recognized as heir and regent of France. Charles VI's own son, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited, declared a rebel and traitor. To seal the alliance, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter, in a union meant to unite the crowns of England and France forever. Chroniclers describe their wedding as both majestic and prophetic, the marriage of the lion and the lily. For Henry, it was the culmination of destiny. Within 5 years, he had achieved what no English monarch before him had dared dream: mastery over both kingdoms. His governance was efficient and just. He won admiration even from his defeated foes. The French populace, weary of endless war, saw in him a bringer of peace and order. When Charles VI died, the crown of France was to pass to Henry and his heirs. It seemed that the 100 Years' War was finally nearing its end, but fate had other plans. While campaigning in central France in 1422, Henry fell ill, likely from dysentery or fever. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained fixed on duty. On his deathbed, at the age of 35, he entrusted his infant son, Henry VI, to his brothers, commanding them to preserve the union he had forged. "Pray for me," he whispered, "for never have I failed my trust to God or to England." When he died, all Europe mourned. The bells of Paris and London tolled in unison, the first and last time they ever would. Henry V's conquests had made England supreme, yet his death left the realm leaderless. Within a few years, the fragile dream of unity would shatter. The Dauphin would rise again, and a peasant girl from Domremy would lead France from despair to salvation. The death of Henry V in 1422 seemed, at first, to secure his dream of a dual monarchy. The Treaty of Troyes had named him heir to the French throne, and upon the death of Charles VI just weeks later, both crowns technically belonged to his infant son, Henry VI, barely 9 months old. England rejoiced, proclaiming their baby King Henry, by the grace of God, King of England and France. But in France, that grace was bitterly contested. The French people were weary of war, yet not broken. Many still regarded the disinherited Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir, as their true sovereign. He ruled only a fragment of the kingdom, centered in the south at Bourges, earning him the mocking nickname King of Bourges. The north and Paris remained under English and Burgundian control, governed by John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's capable brother. The English regency was strong, disciplined, and well-funded. The French resistance, by contrast, was scattered and demoralized. Still, there was an intangible force stirring in the hearts of the French. Not yet hope, but a quiet refusal to surrender. The occupation was brutal. English garrisons ruled through intimidation, imposing taxes and suppressing rebellion with iron fists. In villages, the people whispered prayers not to kings but to saints, begging for deliverance. The Dauphin himself, though kind and intelligent, was uncertain and plagued by doubt. He had never been crowned, never wielded true power, and his legitimacy was questioned by many. France, once the beating heart of Christendom, had become a fractured corpse. Churches stood empty, roads roamed with mercenaries, and famine followed war like a shadow. Chroniclers described it as a kingdom without a king, a body without a soul. And yet, as often happens in history, when nations reach their darkest hour, a spark of divine mystery ignites. In the small, forgotten village of Domremy in eastern France, that spark took human form. A teenage peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, who claimed to hear the voice of heaven itself calling her to save her country. Joan of Arc, born around 1412 in the quiet village of Domremy, grew up in a humble family of farmers. Her world was simple, tending sheep, praying in the chapel, and listening to stories of saints and heroes. Yet, as France burned in endless war, Joan's childhood dreams began to take on divine urgency. At the age of 13, she began to experience what she called voices, celestial messages from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices told her that she was chosen by God to deliver France from its enemies and to lead the Dauphin to his rightful coronation at Reims Cathedral. Her conviction was absolute. To many, her claim would have seemed madness. But Joan's sincerity, courage, and purity of faith inspired awe. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing, and journeyed through hostile territory to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon in early 1429. When she arrived, she was just a 19-year-old girl, illiterate, unknown, and without noble birth. Yet when she was brought before Charles, she recognized him instantly, though he had disguised himself among his courtiers to test her. "Gentle Dauphin," she said calmly, "I am sent by God to give you your kingdom." Skeptical advisors tested her. Priests examined her for heresy. Soldiers mocked her. But Joan's confidence never wavered. "I fear nothing," she declared. "My Lord is with me." Even hardened generals were moved by her faith. Finally, Charles gave her a small army, more as an act of desperation than belief, and sent her to the besieged city of Orleans, a strategic stronghold that had resisted French relief for months. In April 1429, Joan entered Orleans like a blazing comet, dressed in white armor and carrying a banner bearing the words "Jesus Maria." She rode at the front of the army. Her presence electrified the soldiers, turning despair into courage. Within days, the French launched a series of assaults on English fortifications. Joan fought fearlessly, rallying her men whenever they faltered. On May 8th, 1429, Orleans was liberated, the first major French victory in decades. The miracle of Orleans spread like wildfire across France. The girl from Domremy had become the living symbol of divine intervention. For the first time in years, the French dared to believe that their nation could be reborn. After the victory at Orleans, Joan's mission gathered unstoppable momentum. She urged the Dauphin to march north toward Reims, the traditional site where French kings were crowned. The journey was perilous. The English and their Burgundian allies still held much of northern France, and many towns were hostile. Yet, as Joan led the army, towns opened their gates without a fight, swayed by the belief that God himself marched beside her. Chroniclers wrote that her courage was worth 1,000 men. By July 1429, the French army reached Reims. The once doubtful Dauphin, now filled with confidence, entered the great cathedral where his ancestors had been anointed. On July 17th, before thousands of witnesses, Charles VII was crowned King of France, with Joan of Arc standing beside him, holding her banner high. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt before him and said, "Gentle King, now is the will of God fulfilled." It was the most powerful act of national rebirth France had ever seen. The coronation changed everything. It gave France legitimacy, unity, and faith. Even those who had doubted the Dauphin now rallied behind their crowned monarch. Joan's divine mission seemed complete, yet she knew the struggle was not over. The English still occupied Paris, Rouen, and much of Normandy. She pleaded with Charles to continue the war, to strike while the enemy was weak. But politics, jealousy, and fear began to erode the trust she had earned. Court officials, uneasy with her growing influence, urged caution. In the months that followed, Joan led several campaigns, but faced increasing resistance from her own allies. In May 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, she was thrown from her horse and captured by Burgundian forces, who sold her to the English for a vast ransom. France was stunned. Their savior was now a prisoner. Even in chains, Joan's courage did not falter. She would soon face trial, betrayal, and death, but her flame would never be extinguished. In a decade defined by darkness, she had become the light of faith, the spirit of France itself in May 1430, the miracle of France was silenced by the clatter of steel and betrayal. During a sortie outside the town of Compiègne, Joan of Arc found herself surrounded by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. She fought fiercely, her banner whipping through the smoke, but her men were driven back. Pulled from her horse, she was captured and dragged away screaming, not from fear, but from fury that France's holy mission might fail. The Burgundians imprisoned her in the fortress of Beaurevoir, where she endured months of uncertainty, isolation, and temptation to despair. King Charles VII, whose throne she had restored, made no effort to rescue her. The French court, fearful of England's power and jealous of Joan's divine aura, turned its face away. For a ransom of 10,000 livres, the Burgundians sold her to the English, a transaction as cold and cruel as any in history. To her captors, Joan was more than a prisoner. She was a political weapon. Her existence undermined their claim to divine legitimacy. If she truly was sent by God, then England's victories were blasphemous. Thus, the English were determined not merely to silence her, but to destroy her reputation. Transferred to the castle of Rouen, she was held in a cell guarded by rough soldiers, chained by the neck, hands, and feet. She was denied the right of a noble prisoner and refused the comfort of a confessor of her choosing. Yet she never yielded. Her interrogators reported that she prayed constantly, asking only for strength to endure. The same voices that had led her to victory now comforted her in captivity. "It is better to die than to deny what God has made me do," she told them. As word spread that the Maid of Orleans was captured, France sank into mourning. The people whispered that the saints had withdrawn their protection, that heaven had turned its face. But in truth, Joan's mission was not ending. It was entering its most sacred trial. Through her suffering, France would learn faith not in miracles of war, but in the endurance of the soul. In January 1431, the English convened a tribunal at Rouen Cathedral, a proceeding cloaked in legality but rooted in vengeance. The presiding judge was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, an ambitious cleric loyal to the English crown. His goal was clear: to condemn Joan as a heretic and witch, thereby discrediting Charles VII's coronation and the divine cause she had embodied. Over the course of 4 months, she endured one of the most relentless interrogations in history. More than 70 sessions, each designed to trap her in contradictions or theological error. She stood before a hall of scholars, lawyers, and priests, uneducated, alone, and 19 years old. Yet her answers revealed astonishing clarity and courage. When asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, a question meant to condemn her either way, she replied calmly, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me there. I would be the saddest creature alive if I knew I were not in His grace." Even her enemies were struck dumb by her eloquence. Joan was accused of everything from sorcery to dressing in men's clothing, a sin, her accusers claimed, against divine order. She defended herself with reason and conviction, explaining that she wore armor to protect her chastity among soldiers. When it mocked her voices, she answered, "They come from God. How else could I have known what to do?" Her unwavering testimony transformed her trial from a humiliation into a revelation. But the outcome was never in doubt. Political necessity demanded her death. The English could not afford a living saint who undermined their rule. After weeks of exhaustion and deprivation, Joan was forced to sign a confession she did not understand, recanting her visions. When she realized her abjuration meant denying God's command, she retracted it immediately. Her judges declared her a relapsed heretic, the gravest crime against the church. The sentence was death by fire, T-dawn on May 30th, 1431. The bell of Rouen Cathedral tolled mournfully. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, was led from her cell to the marketplace where the stake awaited. She wore a simple white gown and carried a small wooden cross, clutching it tightly as she walked barefoot through the jeering crowd. English soldiers surrounded her. Priests marched ahead chanting psalms, and above her rose the banner of judgment. Heretic, relapsed, idolater. Yet witnesses said her face was serene, as if she saw beyond the hatred that surrounded her. She was tied to the stake, her head lifted toward the sky. "Bishop, I die through you," she cried to Cauchon, then asked for a crucifix. A compassionate soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. Another priest, moved by pity, held a cross high so she could see it until the flames rose. "Jesus, Jesus," she repeated over and over, her voice steady until the smoke engulfed her. The fire consumed her swiftly. When it was done, the executioner wept, saying he feared damnation for what he had done. Joan's ashes were scattered in the Seine River to prevent relics from being taken, but her spirit could not be erased. Even English chroniclers admitted that her courage was more than human. Within decades, the tide of war shifted irrevocably. Inspired by her sacrifice, the French rallied. City by city, they reclaimed their land, until Rouen itself, the place of her death, was liberated in 1449. Joan of Arc became not merely a martyr, but a national myth, a symbol of divine faith and defiance. In 1456, the church formally retried her case and declared her innocent, naming her a true daughter of God. Centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Her death had not ended the war, but it had reborn a nation. The France she died for would rise stronger, united by her flame. The flame that no empire could extinguish. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc in 1431 were meant to extinguish France's hope forever. Yet, paradoxically, they became the light that rekindled a dying nation. Her death at Rouen transformed the conflict from a feudal struggle into a holy crusade for liberation. Across the French countryside, peasants, merchants, and even weary soldiers began to speak her name with reverence. The maid became more than a person. She became a symbol of divine justice, of a France guided not by kings but by faith and destiny. Meanwhile, Charles VII, who had once seemed a weak and uncertain monarch, began to emerge from the shadows. He was haunted by guilt for abandoning Joan, but her sacrifice had given him legitimacy he could never have claimed through politics alone. He understood that France could not survive without reform. Starting in the 1430s, Charles undertook a transformation that would turn him from the King of Bourges into Charles the Victorious. First, he reorganized the army. For centuries, France's wars had been fought by mercenaries and noble levies who obeyed only their own lords. Charles replaced this chaos with the first standing national army in European history. Companies of disciplined soldiers paid directly by the crown. He also created new artillery units that would soon dominate the battlefield. Next came financial reform. Royal taxes, standardized for the first time, provided steady income for the state. Corruption was curbed, and new trade policies helped restore prosperity to cities long ruined by war. Under the guidance of his brilliant minister, Jacques Coeur, France's economy began to revive. But perhaps Charles's greatest achievement was diplomatic. He slowly reconciled with the Duke of Burgundy, whose alliance with England had kept the war alive. Through patience and negotiation, the two sides signed the Treaty of Arras in 1435, ending the feud that had divided France for decades. When Burgundy withdrew its support, the English position collapsed. The tide, once again, had turned, and this time it would not reverse. That'd be why the mid-1430s, the English grip on France began to crumble. Their armies, once invincible under Henry V, now fought defensively, starved of reinforcements and money. In England itself, political divisions deepened. The weak rule of Henry VI, still a child and later a troubled adult, left the kingdom leaderless. The glory of Agincourt had faded into bitter memory. Charles VII seized the opportunity. His reformed armies struck with precision, combining artillery bombardments, cavalry raids, and sieges. French cannons, heavy bronze guns capable of shattering castle walls, became the new terror of war. In 1436, Paris was recaptured, ending 17 years of English occupation. The people wept with joy as Charles entered the city, no longer as a claimant, but as a true king. Over the next decade, the French advanced steadily through Normandy and Gascony. Each campaign followed the same pattern. Towns besieged, English garrisons isolated, and the people welcoming the return of royal authority. The English commanders, now fighting for survival rather than conquest, could do little but retreat. The war that had once been a contest of kings was now a national liberation struggle. The French were fighting for their homeland, for their language, their soil, and the memory of the maid who had died for them. Even chroniclers who once praised England now wrote of divine punishment for her arrogance. In 1450, the French achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Formigny, where their artillery smashed English formations and forced a mass surrender. Normandy, the ancient duchy that had begun this conflict centuries earlier, was reclaimed. The English were pushed back to their final stronghold in the southwest, the region of Gascony, centered on the city of Bordeaux. England's century-long dream of empire was dying. Their soldiers, once conquerors, now fled before the relentless French advance. Across Europe, nations watched in awe as France, thought to be broken forever, rose anew from ashes, united, disciplined, and burning with purpose. In 1453, the final act of the 100 Years' War unfolded at the Battle of Castillon, near Bordeaux, a confrontation that would decide the fate of two nations. The English commander, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the last knights of the old chivalric age, led his men against a French army fortified with powerful artillery. The field at Castillon was unlike the open plains of Crécy or Agincourt. It was a fortress of earthworks, cannons, and trenches, the modern face of war. Talbot, proud and fearless, charged headlong into the French lines, believing his courage could overcome gunpowder. But times had changed. French cannons thundered, tearing through his ranks with devastating precision. When Talbot fell, crushed beneath his horse, the English army broke. The rout was complete. The city of Bordeaux surrendered soon after, and with it, all English holdings in France except Calais. The 100 Years' War was over. For France, the victory was more than territorial. It was spiritual. The nation that had been divided by madness, plague, and invasion was reborn under a single crown. The reforms of Charles VII laid the foundations for a strong, centralized monarchy that would dominate Europe for centuries. The idea of France as a nation, not merely a collection of feudal estates, was born from this crucible of struggle. For England, the end brought introspection and turmoil. The loss of France shattered national pride and plunged the country into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The same nobility that had once conquered France now turned their swords upon each other. The 100 Years' War had transformed the medieval world. It ended the age of knights and castles, ushering in the era of gunpowder and nationalism. It weakened feudalism and gave birth to the modern state. And above all, it left behind legends of kings and traitors, of victory and despair, and of a girl who heard the voice of heaven and died for a crown she never wore. When the smoke cleared in 1453, Europe was no longer the same continent that had entered the war in 1337. The chivalric age was gone. The age of nations had begun. When the guns finally fell silent in 1453, France stood in ruins. Yet from that ruin emerged the foundations of a new world. The 100 Years' War had begun as a dynastic feud between royal families, but it ended as the birth of national identity. For the first time, the French people no longer defined themselves solely by their feudal lord, region, or dialect. They were subjects of one king, united beneath one crown. King Charles VII, once mocked as the King of Bourges, became known as Charles the Victorious. His patient reforms transformed France from a disjointed realm of feudal barons into a centralized monarchy. Through his standing army, he ended the age of mercenary chaos that had ravaged the countryside for generations. His successors would later refine this system into one of Europe's most powerful militaries. The French countryside, devastated by decades of pillage, slowly recovered. Farmers returned to their fields, trade routes reopened, and the monarchy invested in rebuilding bridges, cathedrals, and marketplaces. Towns like Rouen, once the site of Joan of Arc's execution, rose again as centers of commerce and learning. Yet beneath this rebirth lay deep scars. Entire regions had lost half their population to war, famine, and plague. Churches were shattered, noble lineages extinguished, and entire villages erased from maps. But in a paradox only history can forge, this destruction gave France unity. The shared suffering of peasants and nobles alike became the cement of nationhood. Culturally, the war ignited an awakening. Literature began to celebrate the people rather than the nobility. Poets like Christine de Pizan and chroniclers like Jean Froissart captured the shifting world, one where divine providence was now intertwined with human endurance. The French crown, rebuilt upon the ashes of feudalism, entered the Renaissance stronger than ever. France had not merely survived the 100 Years' War. It had been reborn through it. Across the Channel, the end of the war brought neither peace nor renewal. England, once feared as the conqueror of France, entered a spiral of decline. The loss of its continental empire shattered its economy and pride. Generations of English nobles had poured blood and treasure into the French campaigns, only to return home bankrupt and humiliated. Thousands of veterans wandered the countryside, unemployed and embittered, their loyalty shifting to whichever lord could pay them. The monarchy itself teetered on collapse. Henry VI, crowned as both King of England and France in his infancy, grew into a gentle but feeble ruler, devout, scholarly, and wholly unsuited to command. Haunted by mental illness, he drifted between lucidity and delirium, leaving the realm at the mercy of scheming nobles. By the late 1450s, the kingdom imploded into civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal struggle between the House of Lancaster, Henry's line, and the House of York. The conflict that followed mirrored the 100 Years' War in ferocity, but was even more tragic. Brother fought brother, families were extinguished, and the monarchy's authority disintegrated. The very men who had once fought under the English banner at Agincourt now fought each other at Towton, Tewkesbury, and Bosworth Field. Yet even within England's turmoil lay the seeds of transformation. The failure in France forced the kingdom to turn inward, to define itself not as an empire abroad, but as a nation at home. Over time, the monarchy would consolidate power, the nobility would weaken, and Parliament would grow stronger. These shifts would eventually lay the groundwork for a new kind of England, one that would look not toward France, but toward the seas and the world beyond. Thus, while the war ended in defeat, it also forced England to reinvent itself. Out of humiliation emerged exploration, maritime ambition, and, centuries later, empire. The long shadow of 1453 marked both an ending and a beginning. The close of the medieval age and the faint dawn of the modern one, the 100 Years' War not only redrew the political map of Europe, it transformed the very fabric of civilization. When it began in 1337, Europe was a world of knights, castles, and feudal loyalties. By its end in 1453, gunpowder, nationalism, and centralized states had rendered that world obsolete. The age of chivalry, of gallant charges and personal valor, was over. On the battlefield, the longbow and the cannon had proven mightier than any code of honor. The armored knight, once the symbol of medieval power, became vulnerable before the peasant archer and the artillery gunner. Warfare was no longer the domain of aristocratic glory, but of organized armies and technological innovation. Castles fell before bombardments that could shatter stone walls. Kings now needed engineers and treasurers more than justers and poets. Socially, the war accelerated the decline of feudalism. The constant need for soldiers and taxes forced monarchs to bypass feudal lords and appeal directly to the people. This shift strengthened central authority and created the concept of a state, a realm defined not by the will of nobles, but by the sovereignty of a crown representing its people. Culturally, the psychological toll of the war and the Black Death fostered introspection. Artists began to explore mortality and human emotion with new depth. Faith, once unquestioned, became personal and reflective. The same year the war ended, 1453, also witnessed another world-changing event, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, which opened new trade routes and ushered Europe toward the Renaissance. Thus, the 100 Years' War stands as both a grave and a cradle. The grave of medieval Europe, the cradle of the modern West. It forged nations, inspired legends, and taught humanity that even a century of suffering can yield rebirth. The echoes of Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and Rouen did not fade. They shaped the destinies of empires to come. In the end, neither France nor England truly won the war, but both were forever changed by it. From blood and ashes, the modern world was born. The story of the 100 Years' War begins with the ambition of one man, King Edward III of England, whose reign from 1327 to 1377 set Europe ablaze. To understand his legacy is to understand the transformation of kingship itself, from feudal lord to national sovereign. Edward was not born into glory. He inherited a throne weakened by his father's failures and haunted by political chaos. Yet he possessed a rare combination of charisma, military genius, and a vision that reached beyond his island kingdom. In 1337, when Edward claimed the title King of France through his mother's lineage, few could have imagined that his assertion would ignite more than a century of bloodshed. To his contemporaries, it was an audacious gamble. To later generations, it was the birth of modern English identity. Edward's declaration unified his realm as never before. Peasants, nobles, and merchants found common cause in a shared destiny across the Channel. Edward's campaigns, from Crécy to Calais, displayed his mastery of logistics, discipline, and innovation. He transformed England's army from a feudal levy into a professional fighting force, centered on the longbow, a weapon that democratized warfare. His victory at Crécy in 1346 was not merely a battle, it was a revelation. The armored knight, symbol of medieval power, fell before the disciplined precision of English archers. The world watched as the balance of power shifted forever. Yet Edward's brilliance was shadowed by ambition's cost. The later years of his reign saw corruption, exhaustion, and the death of his beloved son, Edward, the Black Prince. The once golden monarch aged into melancholy, surrounded by greedy courtiers. Still, his vision endured. He laid the foundations for a centralized monarchy, strengthened parliament, and fostered the national pride that would shape England's future. Edward III died in 1377, a king who had dreamed of empire but awakened to mortality. His wars left Europe scarred, but his legacy outlived him. In the discipline of his armies, the confidence of his people, and the enduring English sense of destiny. If Edward III was the architect of English power, his son and grandson, Edward the Black Prince and Henry V were its sword and its flame. Both embodied the chivalric ideal, yet both became symbols of how glory and tragedy intertwine. The Black Prince, heir apparent and the hero of Crécy and Poitiers, was the very image of knightly virtue, noble, fearless, and devout. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, he achieved one of the most astonishing victories in military history, capturing King John II of France with a fraction of his opponent's forces. He treated his captive with honor, hosting him as a guest rather than a prisoner, the last true gesture of medieval chivalry before the age of gunpowder. Yet his triumphs masked a deeper truth, the cost of endless war. His campaigns in Spain and Aquitaine drained his health and his spirit. By his mid-30s, the Black Prince was gravely ill, possibly with dysentery or kidney disease. His final years were spent not on the battlefield, but in pain and disillusionment. When he died in 1376, his last request was simple: "Bury me humbly, for I am dust." His epitaph in Canterbury Cathedral still reads, "Such as thou art, sometime was I." He left behind not an empire, but a legend. The knight who had conquered kings yet could not conquer time. Half a century later, Henry V revived that legend. Born in turmoil, he became the embodiment of discipline and faith. His victory at Agincourt in 1415 was a miracle, a resurrection of English valor. Henry was more than a warrior. He was a strategist, administrator, and statesman. His conquest of Normandy and the Treaty of Troyes crowned him heir to the throne of France. Yet like the Black Prince, his destiny burned too brightly. He died at 35, leaving behind an infant son and an empire held together by will alone. Both men lived as mirrors of their age, champions of honor in a world on the brink of modernity. Their lives remind us that even the brightest flames burn briefest, yet their light shapes the centuries that followed. On the French side, the war's legacy belongs not to conquerors, but to rebuilder kings and one immortal saint. Among the rulers of France, Charles V the Wise stands as the quiet genius who restored a broken realm through intellect, patience, and reform. While his father had lost France to pride, Charles reclaimed it through reason. He avoided reckless battles, relied on commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, and rebuilt France's finances and morale. His reign proved that wisdom, not bloodlust, was the true path to strength. But it was his grandson, Charles VII, who completed the resurrection. When he inherited the throne, France was a shattered land, half-conquered, impoverished, and faithless. Yet through reform, diplomacy, and sheer resilience, Charles transformed it into a united nation. He created France's first standing army, ended feudal anarchy, and centralized royal power, setting the stage for the Renaissance monarchy that would one day rule Europe. And standing above them all, like a celestial flame, was Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who defied history. Her life lasted only 19 years, yet she changed the course of civilization. Through her, faith became action, and hope became a weapon. She saw what no general or king could: that France's salvation lay not in pride or revenge, but in unity and divine conviction. Her courage at Orleans, her purity at Reims, and her martyrdom at Rouen turned defeat into resurrection. Even centuries later, Joan's presence remains luminous. She is remembered not as a soldier, but as a symbol of patriotism, of faith, of the indomitable human spirit. Canonized as a saint in 1920, she became France's eternal guardian. Together, Charles V, Charles VII, and Joan of Arc forged the soul of France. Their victories were not won by the sword alone, but by endurance, intelligence, and belief. From their legacy, France rose not merely as a kingdom, but as an idea. When the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, Europe stood at a crossroads between two worlds. The medieval age, with its knights, castles, and faith-bound monarchs, had come to its twilight. In its place dawned a new era of curiosity, creativity, and reason, the Renaissance. Ironically, it was the devastation of the war that cleared the path for rebirth. In France, peace and unity fostered reconstruction. The reforms of Charles VII and his successors laid the administrative foundations for a modern state, capable of supporting art, science, and culture. The cathedral towns, once echoing with cannon fire, now rang with the voices of poets, sculptors, and architects. Paris, scarred but unbroken, emerged as a center of intellect and style. Across the Loire Valley, kings built magnificent chateaus, symbols not of war, but of refinement and beauty. The intellectual climate also shifted dramatically. During the war, chroniclers like Jean Froissart had glorified knights and battles. Afterward, thinkers began to question the nature of power, destiny, and humanity itself. The trauma of a century-long conflict, combined with the Black Death and social upheavals, inspired reflection on mortality and meaning. The once unquestioned authority of feudalism and the church gave way to an age of humanism, emphasizing reason and the potential of mankind. Iron and fire had paved the way for brush and ink. The French monarchy, strengthened by centralization, became the great patron of learning and the arts. Meanwhile, the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century accelerated the spread of knowledge faster than any army ever could. Europe was entering a golden age born from the ashes of its darkest war. In this transformation lay the war's greatest paradox, that from destruction emerged creation. The 100 Years' War had ended the medieval world, but in doing so, it had given birth to modern civilization. The 100 Years' War reshaped not only borders, but the very idea of power. Before 1337, Europe had been a mosaic of fiefs, duchies, and petty lordships. Loyalty was local, and kings ruled by personal alliances. But by 1453, the concept of nationhood had emerged. Subjects began to see themselves as citizens, bound not merely by a monarch's bloodline, but by a shared language, culture, and destiny. France led this transformation. The unity forged under Charles VII evolved into a centralized monarchy that embodied the will of its people. For the first time, the French saw themselves not as Burgundians, Gascons, or Normans, but as Français. This sense of national identity, strengthened by collective suffering and divine victory, became the foundation of French patriotism that would endure for centuries. England, too, found new purpose. Though defeated, the island kingdom turned inward, away from continental conquest. The loss of France forced it to define itself as a singular, self-contained realm. The English language, long overshadowed by Norman French, became the voice of law, literature, and government. Writers like Chaucer and later Shakespeare would elevate it into one of the richest tongues in human history. Faith also changed. The war, coupled with the plague, had shaken confidence in the church's infallibility. How could divine justice allow such endless suffering? Priests and philosophers sought new interpretations of God's will. The seeds of reform were sown, seeds that would blossom a century later into the Protestant Reformation. Socially, the power of the common man had grown. Longbowmen, foot soldiers, and artisans had proven as vital to victory as nobles. The myth of divine aristocracy weakened. Peasants began to demand rights. Towns asserted independence. And a new middle class, merchants and professionals, rose to prominence. Feudalism, once unshakable, was crumbling. In its place rose the early skeleton of the modern social order, dynamic, mobile, and driven by merit rather than blood. The 100 Years' War had not only redrawn the map, it had redefined humanity's understanding of who holds power and why. Even centuries after its end, the 100 Years' War continued to haunt the imagination of Europe. Its legends, heroes, and tragedies became part of the continent's soul, shaping art, literature, and politics long after the last arrow was fired. The chroniclers of the time, from Froissart to Monstrelet, immortalized its battles as epics of valor and betrayal. Painters depicted the coronations of kings, the burning of Joan of Arc, the thunder of Agincourt. To future generations, it was not just a war, but a mirror of human nature. Ambition, faith, pride, and redemption intertwined. For France, Joan of Arc became an eternal symbol, a saint of courage and national unity. Her story inspired not only devotion but resistance. In later centuries, whenever France faced invasion or despair, her memory rekindled hope. From the Revolution to World War II, she stood as the embodiment of the nation's indomitable spirit. In England, the war became legend, a source of nostalgia for a lost age of glory. Poets and dramatists resurrected its heroes. Shakespeare's Henry V, written nearly 2 centuries later, transformed Agincourt into a timeless lesson on leadership and sacrifice. The king's famous rallying cry, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," would echo through every English battlefield thereafter. But beyond nationalism and myth, the 100 Years' War left a deeper lesson. It showed that power built on ambition alone cannot last, that faith, once weaponized, becomes a double-edged sword, and that human endurance, even through generations of darkness, can rebuild what war destroys. It marked the end of the Middle Ages, but also the beginning of everything that would follow. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and eventually the modern world. The cannons that fell silent in 1453 did not merely end a conflict, they ended an epic. And from the ruins of that century-long struggle arose the 2 great nations that would shape history for the next 500 years, France and England. Their rivalry had given Europe its pain, its progress, and its soul. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its echoes would never die. The screen fades from black. A golden dawn spills across the medieval countryside, wind rippling through banners of red and blue, church bells tolling across distant fields. The voice begins softly, echoing through time. In the year 1337, 2 crowns shared one destiny, and one throne too many. The camera sweeps over Westminster Abbey, where King Edward III stands proud, his armor gleaming in candlelight. Across the Channel, in Paris, Philip VI of Valois dons the fleur-de-lis. Between them lies a world about to burn. Music swells, strings tense with foreboding, as ships fill the English Channel, sails whipping in the wind. The narration deepens. What began as a quarrel of kings would become a century of fire. Cut to the Battle of Crécy, slow-motion arrows slicing through the air, the sky darkened by the storm of war. English longbowmen stand firm as French knights thunder forward. Horses crash, armor shatters, and mud churns red. Then silence. A haunting bell tolls over the field of corpses. From the carnage, the frame transitions to Calais, its starving citizens kneeling in surrender before Edward. The soft face of Queen Philippa pleads for mercy, her voice breaking the stillness. The king nods, and history exhales. Then, the music changes, dark, ominous, as shadows creep across Europe. Black sails arrive at a harbor. A single rat crawls across a rope. The Black Death descends. Towns empty, fields rot, and monasteries echo with prayers of despair. War had slain thousands. The plague would claim millions. Fade to candlelight flickering over a dying man's face. The Black Prince, once invincible, now frail, whispering his final words, "Bury me humbly, for I am dust." The light dims, thunder rolls. The screen flashes 100 years, 1,000 battles, one destiny. The music rises once more, drums of war, the sound of nations awakening. The sound of horses fades into wind and prayer. A church bell echoes. The scene opens on a lonely village in Domremy. Dawn mist over meadows, a girl tending sheep. Joan of Arc, barefoot, gazes heavenward. A whisper fills the soundscape, not from men, but from angels. In the silence of despair, one voice dared to speak for God. The camera follows her journey, riding through rain, clad in armor, her white banner glowing in the night. Soldiers kneel as she passes. The music swells like a hymn. We cut to Orleans, the gates aflame, cannon smoke filling the sky. Joan charges through the chaos, her banner high. Arrows hiss, but she stands untouched. Her voice pierces the din. In God's name, forward. The city erupts in victory. Bells ring, flags rise, tears fall. The war that had seemed eternal now trembles with hope. Transition, Reims Cathedral. The great doors open to sunlight. The coronation unfolds in breathtaking splendor. Golden light filtering through stained glass. Charles VII kneels before the altar, the crown placed upon his head. Behind him, Joan stands radiant, her armor reflecting divine light. The chorus soars, Latin chants blending with triumphant strings. But triumph fades into darkness. The next scene cuts sharply. Torches in the night, the clang of chains, the cold walls of Rouen. Joan kneels alone, whispering prayers as her judges circle her like wolves. A single candle burns beside her, the last flame of faith. The tempo slows. We see her at the stake, her face illuminated by the fire's glow. Smoke rises toward the heavens. Her last words echo softly. Jesus, Jesus. The screen fills with fire, then white light. The music dissolves into stillness. They burned her body, but not her belief. For through her sacrifice, a nation remembered its soul. The light fades, replaced by the thunder of cannons. Charles VII's armies advance. The French banners return, sweeping through Normandy and Gascony. Castillon erupts in flame. The final battle, where old chivalry dies beneath gunpowder's roar. The screen opens on a sunrise over Rouen. No longer a city of execution, but of rebirth. Cathedral bells ring again, not for death, but for deliverance. The narrator's tone deepens, soft, reflective, solemn. In 1453, the 100 Years' War ended, but in its ending, a new world began. The camera pans over France. Villages rebuilt, bridges spanning rivers, fields blooming once more. Children run where soldiers once marched. In Paris, artisans carve statues, scholars write by candlelight, and a king, Charles VII, stands at his palace balcony watching the city live again. Then the lens crosses the channel. England, silent, gray, its banners folded. A solitary crown rests upon a marble tomb. Henry VI, frail and lost, walks through shadowed halls. Yet, even in defeat, a new future stirs. Ships setting sail westward beyond the horizon. The music swells into a vast orchestral crescendo. Violins, drums, and choirs, as a time-lapse montage shows centuries passing. Renaissance paintings, the sails of explorers, the ink of Shakespeare's quill, the fluttering flags of revolution. The narrator speaks as history rushes forward. Out of a century of war came 5 centuries of progress, the birth of the modern world. From faith and fire came nation and reason. From the ashes of kings rose the spirit of mankind. Finally, the camera returns to Joan of Arc's statue in Reims Cathedral, her sword raised, her gaze eternal. Light spills through the stained glass, bathing her in gold. The music softens into a single piano note. The voice whispers the final words. The 100 Years' War did not end with victory or defeat. It ended with awakening. For when men learned the cost of crowns, they began to seek the worth of souls. The voice of your documentary must breathe the weight of centuries, powerful, measured, resonant. The tone should travel like the arc of the war itself, rising in confidence with Edward III's early victories, deepening through despair in the time of the plague, breaking into fire and faith with Joan of Arc, and ending in reflective stillness as nations are reborn. The narration pace should follow the rhythm of the human heartbeat, roughly 80 to 100 words per minute in calm scenes, slower during reflection, and faster in moments of tension or battle. Avoid monotony. Let the voice act as the emotional compass, not just describing events, but guiding the listener's soul through them. For Edward III and Henry V, use a regal, commanding tone, proud, confident, carrying the echo of drums and banners. For the Black Death and the Plague years, shift to a low, distant register, a whisper of loss carried on the wind. When narrating Joan of Arc, soften into reverence and conviction. Let off fill the pauses. The moment she hears the voices, your narrator must drop into near silence before lifting the pitch slightly, as if the air itself trembles with divine resonance. During battle sequences, Crécy, Agincourt, Castillon, pacing becomes rhythmic and staccato. Sentences shorten, breath becomes audible. The narrator should speak as though time slows around the chaos, describing smoke, rain, arrows, letting the words paint pictures before the sound effects overwhelm them. In the epilogue scenes, the tone must age with history. Speak like time itself, wise, calm, infinite. Imagine the voice echoing through cathedrals, across battlefields long reclaimed by grass. The final line, from faith and fire, the world was reborn, should be delivered almost as a prayer, fading naturally, without dramatic swell. Finally, emphasize silence. The pauses between sentences are as crucial as the words. Let the audience feel the air of centuries, the sound of memory itself. The soundtrack is the beating heart of your production. It translates emotion where words cannot reach. Each phase of the war deserves its own sonic identity, evolving like a musical chronicle of Europe's transformation. Begin the film with low cellos and distant church bells, symbolizing medieval order and divine hierarchy. As Edward III declares war, let taiko drums and French horns thunder beneath a rising orchestral swell. Introduce faint Gregorian chanting in Latin, giving the impression of religion watching silently from above. At the Battle of Sluys, the sound must be a storm. Layered percussion mimicking crashing waves, the clash of steel echoing through the score. Transition into minor strings for the Siege of Calais. Slow, relentless, evoking starvation and endurance. For the Black Death, strip the sound to near silence. Replace melody with ambient drones, a single note sustained beneath the toll of church bells. Add whispering winds, footsteps in empty streets, and faint chanting recorded in cathedral acoustics. It must feel like the world holding its breath. When Joan of Arc enters the story, the music must bloom. Introduce harp arpeggios and female choirs, blending innocence with divinity. Her victories, particularly the liberation of Orleans, should erupt into triumphant crescendos of violins and brass, but with restraint, avoiding Hollywood triumphalism. The aim is spiritual victory, not conquest. During her trial and execution, let the music fall away entirely, replaced by the raw sound of flame, wind, and a single human heartbeat. As her last word fades, bring back a soft choral motif, her theme transformed into light. The final chapters, the French Resurgence and Castillon, should mix modern cinematic percussion with traditional medieval instruments, lute, psaltery, frame drum. The result is timeless, old and new colliding, just as the war bridged two worlds. End credits must feature a slow, elegiac theme, strings and piano intertwined, echoing across ruins and rivers. Let the score end on an unresolved chord, a sonic question left to history itself. The film's visuals must move like memory, blending realism with symbolism. Each era of the war should have its own color palette and camera rhythm, evolving as centuries pass. The opening chapters, 1337 to 1350, should feel medieval and painterly. Golden dawn light, soft vignettes, slow dolly shots across castles, scrolls, and manuscripts. Use warm tones, crimson, brass, and parchment yellow. Every frame should resemble an illuminated manuscript brought to life. During the Crécy, Calais campaigns, introduce grit, handheld camera energy, fog-drenched landscapes, and high-contrast lighting. The frame should breathe mud, smoke, and tension. At the moment of the longbow volleys, the camera must freeze in slow motion, arrows suspended in air as thunder rolls in reverse. Transition into the plague years with cold desaturation. Replace sunlight with candlelight. Shadows should dominate, symbolizing death's omnipresence. Motion slows. Dust and silence become visual metaphors. Then, for Joan of Arc's arc, shift dramatically. Use white light, lens flares, and shallow depth of field to convey divine radiance. As she leads armies, track her banner from low angles, sunlight glowing through its silk. At Reims, bathe the cathedral in warm gold. Every stained glass reflection becomes a living halo. The trial at Rouen demands minimalism, static frames, gray-blue tones, and the flicker of torchlight. The camera must not move during her execution. Let the audience endure stillness, a painter's composition frozen in agony. Finally, as the narrative closes, release the lens. Wide aerial shots of rivers, meadows, and cathedrals under sunrise symbolize rebirth. Transition from dark blues to luminous whites, ending with the color of parchment. The story written and complete. Overlay faint whispers in Old French and English, fragments of battle cries, prayers, and songs, fading into one another like ghosts. Then silence, before the screen fades to black and the final line appears. The 100 Years' War, from fire and faith, the world was reborn. Directing a historical epic is not about recreating the past. It's about resurrecting emotion through time. Every frame must breathe as though the centuries themselves are alive. The key is temporal layering, allowing different eras of the war to possess their own visual rhythm. The film should open in stillness. Long static shots of morning mist over meadows. Medieval villages awakening under pale sunlight. This is the calm before the centuries. The camera lingers on ordinary life. Blacksmith hammering, children chasing geese, parchment maps unrolled across a wooden table. These quiet glimpses root the audience in humanity before the storm of politics begins. As Edward III proclaims his claim to France, the camera transitions to symbolic framing. A slow circular pan around his throne room, candlelight reflecting off golden armor. This moment must feel inevitable, as if destiny itself is closing its circle. When the war begins, cut to wide aerials of ships crossing the channel, sails snapping in wind, gulls scattering above the surf, followed by quick cuts of letters sealed with wax and delivered across courts. The imagery should feel alive with motion, but ordered by rhythm, echoing the pulse of drums. Use natural light wherever possible to create authenticity. Candle flame, moonlight through arrow slits, sunlight diffused by fog. These become emotional cues rather than decoration. Avoid modern symmetry. Instead, embrace painterly imbalance, as if each frame could have been drawn by a chronicler's hand. In battle scenes, resist the temptation for spectacle. Instead of showing chaos in every frame, use perspective. Let the camera follow one soldier, one heartbeat, through confusion. At Crécy or Agincourt, the lens should stay low, at eye level, mud splashing against it, arrows streaking across blurred sky. Cut between close combat and wide stillness. Silence after noise. to mimic the rhythm of war itself, terror followed by the unbearable quiet of victory. Finally, remember that time in this film is elastic. Centuries can pass between two raindrops if emotion demands it. History is not linear here. It's breathing, remembering, and reliving all at once. Editing historical storytelling is an act of controlled heartbeat. The rhythm must flow like a river, never static, never forced. Each transition is a breath between centuries. The goal is not speed, but immersion, guiding the viewer through time as though walking through a dream that never breaks. Begin with fade-through-light transitions instead of hard cuts. Let candle flames dissolve in a sunrise. Let ink dripping on parchment morph into blood on a battlefield. Each match cut should remind the viewer that war and writing, memory and violence are inseparable. For example, when chroniclers dip their quills after Crécy, cut directly to arrows being drawn from quivers. Ink and war, the twin tools of legacy. Maintain tempo contrast. Peaceful sequences should breathe in long takes, 20, 30 seconds of continuous motion, while combat should break into rapid edits under 2 seconds. The change in rhythm shocks the senses, capturing how medieval people must have felt when their world erupted overnight. Yet avoid overcutting. The viewer must still comprehend geography and emotional stakes. Sound design is part of the edit. When moving from war to reflection, let the ringing of swords fade into the echo of church bells or a heartbeat. During plague scenes, overlap whispered prayers across cuts, so the voices of the dead linger into the next frame. This continuity of sound binds ears together, making history feel unbroken. Color grading must follow an emotional arc. Early acts, Edward's ambition and the first battles, should glow in warm bronze and sepia, resembling illuminated manuscripts. Mid-war sequences, the plague, the fall of Calais, desaturate into grays and greens, the tone of decay. Joan of Arc's rise brings pure light. Whites and golds burst through clouded skies. Her execution plunges the palette to charcoal and crimson, but the final coronation and epilogue return to dawn colors, pale yellow and blue, symbolizing renewal. Every edit should carry meaning. Never cut only for motion, cut for emotion. Each dissolve, each silence, should advance the viewer's understanding of loss, courage, and rebirth. What separates a historical documentary from a cinematic epic is empathy. The director's task is not to parade battles, but to reveal the fragile humanity inside them. The lens must look not at kings first, but at faces, weary soldiers, praying mothers, the eyes of a dying night reflecting the sky. During performances, instruct narrators and actors to resist modern emotion. Medieval feeling is restrained, expressed through gesture, ritual, and prayer. Show tears only when silence has built them. When depicting Edward III's triumph, hold the camera on his expression after victory, pride dissolving into exhaustion before cutting away. When Henry V kneels at Agincourt, capture the mud clinging to his hands, the humility beneath glory. For Joan of Arc, use the subjective camera. Let the audience see flashes of her visions, streaks of light, blurred figures of saints, the wind-shifting banners, not as special effects, but as sensations. The camera itself becomes her faith, trembling yet resolute. During her trial, keep the lens tight on her face, isolating her from her judges. The closer we see her courage, the more the viewer feels her isolation. The closing sequences must blend all emotions, grief, reverence, transcendence. Use slow-motion shots of nature reclaiming the battlefield, wildflowers growing over helmets, rivers washing away arrows, sunlight filtering through ruins. Overlay faint echoes of earlier voices, Edward, Henry, Joan, whispering through time, merging into one final breath. The film should end with a slow pullback from Earth, showing the green of France and England beneath a morning haze. The narrator's voice, calm and eternal, speaks the last line. Time conquers kings, but memory crowns them forever. The screen fades to parchment texture, the sound of a quill writing the words Finus Historia. The story ends, but the echo continues. Editing history is the art of sculpting time, turning 1,000 years of silence into rhythm. The editor's task is not simply to cut, but to conduct emotion. Each transition, pause, and crossfade must feel as deliberate as a heartbeat. For this documentary, the goal is to create an uninterrupted emotional current, flowing through centuries without a single drop of tension lost. Begin by dividing the 2-hour runtime into 3 narrative movements, mirroring the structure of a symphony. Movement I, the fire of ambition, 1337 to 1360. Edward III's rise, Crécy and Calais. Movement 2, the shadow of despair, 1360 to 1420. The plague, the fall, and the miracle of Henry V. Movement 3, the flame of faith, 1420 to 1453. Joan of Arc, France's rebirth, and the war's end. Each movement must have its own tempo. The first is vigorous and bold. Quick cuts, triumphant brass tones, sweeping transitions. The second is heavy and introspective. Lingering shots dissolves a rhythm of exhaustion. The third ascends, measured pacing mixed with divine intensity, each frame glowing with spiritual momentum. Use editing rhythm as emotional geometry. 4 battle sequences. Imagine rhythm as heartbeat acceleration. 1-second cuts for charge scenes, half-second cuts for chaos, then an abrupt 6-second hold on aftermath. That stillness is not silence. It's the echo of mortality. After every explosion of violence, let time dilate. Allow the audience to breathe in history's cost. Avoid linear time-lapse storytelling. Use memory transitions, matching visual motifs rather than chronology. For example, let the torchlight of Calais fade directly into candlelight over Joan's trial transcripts, connecting suffering across generations. The audience must feel that centuries bleed together. Finally, never fear silence. A scene of a king's hand resting on a sword can say more than 10 sentences. Give weight to shadows, to pauses, to the sound of pages turning. Remember Tarkovsky's principle. The rhythm of a film is the breathing of its soul. Let your edit breathe like the past itself. Slow, vast, eternal. In post-production, color grading becomes your emotional brush. Every hue carries psychological memory. Use it to shape the audience's perception of each era. The Edwardian phase, 1337 to 1360, should gleam in warm bronze and pale sunlight, an echo of medieval optimism. Apply golden LUTs and soft contrast, letting sunlight flare slightly through clouds. The tone is heroic but human, like a painting by Froissart turned alive. As the war darkens into the plague years, strip away color saturation. Desaturate skin tones, deepen blacks, and add green-gray tints to shadows. Introduce faint film grain, symbolizing rot and decay. Candlelight must flicker unevenly, hinting that even flame fears the dark. Use light as a metaphor. In dying villages, allow only moonlight to touch stone walls, suggesting a world bereft of God's warmth. When Joan of Arc enters, invert the palette entirely. Flood the frame with pure whites, blues, and golds, tones of sanctity and courage. Let light break through clouds as she speaks. Use soft diffusion filters to create a glowing aura around her armor, but keep it subtle. Divinity should feel natural, not supernatural. For the final victories, 1436 to 1453, restore richness, balance daylight, deep greens of meadows, the royal blue of banners against golden skies. This gradual color evolution mirrors France's resurrection, a visual resurrection through hue. Add motion overlays for depth, drifting dust in ruined cathedrals, fluttering banners, faint embers carried by wind. These micro-movements keep each frame alive, even in stillness. When the narration speaks of memory, overlay gentle motes of light that drift upward like souls ascending, a motif recurring through all acts. Finally, ensure that every transition breathes through light, not hard cuts. Fade through brightness during moments of hope and through darkness during despair. Light itself becomes your narrative voice, the silent chronicler of time. When all footage, narration, and music converge, the final cut must feel like destiny unfolding. It's not just a sequence of events, but a living organism with heartbeats, breaths, and dreams. Structure the 2-hour film with 3 major crescendos, separated by reflective valleys. The first crescendo peaks with Crécy, fading into silence over Calais. The second builds toward Agincourt, culminating in Henry's prayer. The third rises through Joan's execution and resolves with the final liberation of France. Each peak should carry emotional echo. The audience must feel triumph tinged with sorrow, for every victory in this war costs something irreplaceable. The narration track should be mixed slightly ahead of ambient sound by about 3 dB, maintaining clarity while merging naturally with the score. Avoid constant background noise. Let soundscapes emerge organically. For instance, blend the faint hum of wind over ruins before transition, or distant bells when mentioning faith. Integrate motion graphics sparingly but with elegance. Maps should animate slowly, parchment-colored, ink spreading like veins, as if history writes itself on screen. Use white serif typography for key years or quotes, fading them gently into the texture of the background. Avoid modern digital shine. Aim for realism that feels carved from time. During the closing 10 minutes, the pacing must decelerate, each image lingering like memory, refusing to fade. Use cross dissolves lasting 5 to 7 seconds, synchronized with orchestral diminuendo. Let the music's final notes fade onto the narrator's last line. When the fire cooled and the faith endured, mankind began anew. Then silence. Only the rustle of parchment turning. A single candle burns out, smoke curling upward. Fade to black. Hold the black screen for 4 seconds, an eternity on film, before the final credit appears. History teller YT, written in time, spoken in faith. This is not just the end of a documentary. It is the preservation of memory through art. The war reborn through image, rhythm, and sound. Every great historical film is, in truth, an act of resurrection. When the director captures a moment lost to centuries, a hand gripping a sword, a candle flickering over parchment, the tremor in a queen's voice, he does not merely recreate, he reawakens. The camera becomes the instrument of time's forgiveness. Through it, history breathes again. The frame is not just a picture, it is light made conscious. In a story like the 100 Years' War, every ray of sunlight and every shadow carries moral weight. Light reveals, but it also sanctifies. When it falls upon Joan of Arc's face at dawn, it is not illumination, it is revelation. When it glints off a dying knight's armor, it whispers that even in defeat, there is dignity. To film history is to write scripture with photons. You must approach the lens not as an eye, but as a soul. The goal is not to show what happened, but to show what it meant. The audience must feel the divine in the ordinary, the holiness in a peasant's tear, the tragedy in a crown. Use light as the thread that stitches centuries together. Let the same golden hue that warms Edward III's coronation return to bathe the fields of Castillon. That cyclical illumination tells a silent truth, that history moves not in lines, but in circles. The victories and sufferings of men are reflections of the same eternal flame. Remember also the spiritual silence within vision. A good shot does not shout, it listens. It allows stillness to carry truth where words cannot go. Film is not about spectacle, but about presence, that fragile intersection between mortality and memory. Thus, the eternal frame is not a device of cinema, but of consciousness. It is where history and light become one, the place where storytelling turns into prayer. In the art of historical storytelling, Accuracy is sacred, yet truth is greater than accuracy. To film the past faithfully is not merely to count its dates and kings, but to understand its humanity. Facts are the bones of history, but emotion is its heartbeat. Without that rhythm, even the most precise chronicle remains lifeless. The director must become both historian and pilgrim. You must walk through the ruins of memory not as a scholar, but as one seeking forgiveness for forgetting. Every frame you compose should carry humility, the awareness that you are interpreting souls, not statistics. When you tell the story of Henry V, you are not recording a monarch's triumph. You are revealing the fragility behind command, the loneliness beneath the crown. There's a moral dimension to how history is filmed. Violence must never be glamorized. The camera should bear witness, not delight. At Crécy, the arrows may fall in beauty, but the aftermath must ache. The muddy field littered with broken armor and prayers whispered for the dead. The viewer should leave not with thrill, but with reverence. Equally, heroism must not erase suffering. Joan of Arc's fire is not to be shown as spectacle, but as transcendence. The audience must see the human pain, the trembling, the smoke, the breath, before the miracle of faith. The goal is empathy, not entertainment. When editing, balance grandeur with humility. Let the king's speeches share space with the silence of peasants. Let the cry of the trumpet dissolve into the sob of a widow. That juxtaposition is the moral heartbeat of historical cinema. The reminder that all glory is borrowed, and every empire ends where compassion begins. Ultimately, the truth of history lies not in the events, but in the echoes. To capture those echoes is to honor the past. When the credits roll, the audience should not remember your film as a show, but as a confession of time itself. When the final scene fades, when the music softens, when the audience exhales after 2 hours of journeying through faith and war, your film does not end. It simply changes form. It enters them. Each viewer carries a spark of your vision forward, becoming a living continuation of the story. That is the eternal frame, the invisible cinema within human memory. Art that survives is never just seen, it is felt again. The 100 Years' War, as you have told it, is not a museum piece, but a mirror. It reflects the endless cycle of ambition and redemption, showing that humanity has always been both cruel and divine. Through your film, the Middle Ages are not remote centuries. They are today's conscience dressed in armor. Every choice you made, the slow pullback from Rheims Cathedral, the candle smoke curling in the dark, the whispered line, "Time conquers kings, but memory crowns them forever," becomes a gesture toward eternity. Such moments do not belong to history. They belong to myth, and myth is immortal. Your duty as a storyteller is to preserve this immortality responsibly. Never chase fame or numbers. Chase meaning. The views will fade, but the vision will remain. You are not just making a documentary. You're constructing a vessel through which truth may outlive the age of algorithms. The eternal frame exists wherever a heart is moved by remembrance. It may glow on a screen, or flicker in a candle's reflection, or live in the silence between words. Each time someone hears Joan's voice, or watches a soldier kneel at dawn, history stirs once more. And that is the final revelation. Cinema is not bound by time. When wielded with sincerity, it becomes prayer, a dialogue between the living and the dead. Through it, your History Teller YT series becomes more than storytelling. It becomes remembrance made visible, a monument of light carved in the air. Every great creation begins not with inspiration, but with burden. The storyteller carries a fire too heavy for silence, a calling that whispers through centuries. You feel it before you name it. That ache in the chest when truth hides beneath dust. It is not ambition that drives you to make history breathe again. It is devotion. The burden of creation is holy and cruel, for it asks everything and promises nothing. When you create a film like the 100 Years' War, you do not merely retell facts. You stand before the ghosts of time and ask permission to speak. You borrow their voices, their pain, their triumphs. You kneel before their memory, promising not spectacle, but sincerity. That vow is the foundation of sacred art. Creation demands sacrifice, long nights of writing, the editing that feels endless, the haunting perfectionism of matching a single word to a single sound. These are not chores, they are rituals. Every scene you craft is an offering to eternity. Every frame you shape is a prayer whispered into the void. And yet, the deeper truth of creation is loneliness. No one else can see the world burning inside your mind until you show it. The filmmaker, like the historian, walks alone through the corridors of time, collecting fragments of light, piecing together lives, resurrecting souls. That solitude, though painful, is pure. It is the crucible in which meaning is forged. The reward comes not in applause, but in recognition, when one heart, perhaps centuries later, understands what you meant. That moment of connection, invisible yet infinite, redeems all effort. You realize then that creation was never about fame. It was about communion between you, the past, and the divine pulse of truth. Thus, the burden of the creator is not to conquer time, but to serve it, to hold its stories gently, to guard its silence, and to give them voice again, even when your own trembles. To be a storyteller of history is to carry sacred responsibility. You are not only shaping memory, you're shaping meaning. The images you create will live longer than you. They will outlast governments, languages, and even belief systems. One careless frame can distort truth. One honest moment can redeem centuries of forgetting. When filming or writing history, you must ask 3 questions before each decision. Does this honor the humanity of those who lived it? Does it illuminate truth rather than decorate it? Does it invite compassion rather than division? These are not rules of art. They are rules of conscience. The storyteller's weapon is empathy. It cuts deeper than any sword because it pierces ignorance. When you show the suffering of a soldier or the courage of a saint, you are not glorifying them. You are holding a mirror to humanity. The audience should not simply watch your story. They should feel responsible for it. Avoid the temptation of drama for drama's sake. History has enough blood. It needs your mercy. Portray violence as consequence, not celebration. Portray power as burden, not glamour. Let your film teach that every empire, no matter how bright, leaves shadows behind. As you construct your art, remember that truth and beauty must walk together. Beauty without truth is vanity. Truth without beauty is despair. Your task is to weave them until the audience cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. In this age of noise, where content floods every screen, your art must be a cathedral of silence. Let your audience breathe, think, and pray inside it. Do not chase trends, chase timelessness. It is better to create one eternal film than 100 forgettable ones. When future creators study your work, may they find not perfection, but integrity. Let them say, "He told stories not to be remembered, but so others might remember better." That is the mark of a true creator, to vanish into the echo of his message. When all is finished, when the script has been written, the voice recorded, the final cut exported, the creator stands alone again. The room is quiet. The lights flicker on the monitor. You press play, and for a moment, the centuries move before you like a living prayer. That is when you understand creation is not about making something new. It is about returning what was lost. The true legacy of a filmmaker is invisible. It is not measured in awards or followers, but in the private awakenings of strangers. Somewhere, a student will hear your narration and choose to study history. Somewhere, an artist will learn that beauty and truth can coexist. Somewhere, a soul will cry for a war that ended 600 years ago, and in that tear, time will heal. That is immortality. Faith sustains the creator. Not religious faith alone, but the faith that your work matters, even when no one sees it. Faith that the light you've shaped will reach someone, someday. Creation without faith becomes vanity. Creation with faith becomes resurrection. The eternal frame you built through your series now becomes your testament. Proof that one voice, armed with sincerity and vision, can bridge centuries. You have spoken across languages through history, through fire and silence, to remind the world that remembrance is not an act of nostalgia, but of duty. As you close this monumental work, speak not in pride, but in gratitude. Thank the souls of the past for allowing you to tell their story. Thank the future for listening. And thank the moment, this fleeting, luminous now, for being your stage between the two. The world is silent now. The echoes of swords and sermons have faded into the great hush of eternity. The camera drifts slowly over fields once red with war, now glimmering with dew beneath a gentle dawn. The voice returns, softer, slower, as if it comes from the soul of history itself. Let all that was broken be remembered not in sorrow, but in meaning. The story of the 100 Years' War was never about crowns or borders. It was about the fragile eternity hidden in human courage. Beneath every battle lay a heartbeat. Beneath every throne, a trembling conscience. Beneath every death, a whisper of faith. The creator who tells this story is not its master, but its witness, the keeper of echoes, the guardian of flame. In the quiet of creation, time itself kneels. The years bow like weary soldiers, laying their armor at the feet of remembrance. What endures is not victory, but the will to remember. That is the benediction of all history, that nothing truly passes away while a single heart still recalls it. The prayer rises not from cathedrals, but from the simple breath of those who endured. The widow lighting a candle, the child tracing a name upon a grave, the scribe writing by moonlight. Their small acts become the pillars of civilization. And in this moment, as the film closes its eyes, the past and the present embrace. The camera lifts into sunlight, revealing no armies, no kings, only the sky. Its color is not gold nor blue, but something between, the hue of eternity itself. Imagine a river flowing through the ages, not of water, but of memory. Its current carries voices, the laughter of children from villages long gone, the cries of soldiers who never saw home again, the hymns of monks who prayed through plague and famine. Each ripple is a century, each reflection a life. You, the storyteller, have followed this river from its first spark to its quiet horizon. You have seen empires bloom like flowers and crumble like dust. You have watched faith tested by flame and love endure through ruin. What remains is not history, but truth purified by time. As the film's music deepens, the camera glides over landscapes that merge past and present. Ruins entwined with roots, towers half swallowed by earth, cathedrals open to the stars. The voice speaks again, not in narration now, but in benediction. All things return to silence, but the silence remembers all things. That is the essence of storytelling, to become the silence that remembers. The creator does not command history, he listens to it. In every story you tell, you are both author and pilgrim, walking barefoot through time's long corridor. The river widens. Its waters catch the light of distant suns. Shadows of Edward, Henry, Charles, and Joan drift across its surface, not as ghosts, but as reflections of eternal archetypes. Ambition, honor, wisdom, faith. They do not speak. They simply look forward into the endless flow. The scene slows. A single white feather lands upon the river, light, delicate, timeless. It floats across centuries, carried by memory. The music fades to a heartbeat, then to wind. The final scene begins not with sound, but with stillness, a stillness that feels alive. A single candle burns in the darkness, its flames steady and pure. Around it, shadows dance like ghosts of centuries. The narrator's voice, calm, reverent, infinite, begins to speak the last benediction. In every age, light has one purpose, to be shared. This flame is not yours alone. It belonged to every historian who wrote, every warrior who prayed, every poet who remembered. You carried it for a time, and now you pass it forward to another creator, another seeker, another heart unafraid to remember. The camera circles slowly around the candle. Its light fills the screen, revealing faint reflections of all who came before. The soldiers, the peasants, the kings, the saints. Their faces blur together into one radiant mosaic, humanity itself. The music swells, not triumphant, but transcendent. Strings rise like dawn over water. Choirs whisper the Latin word memoria. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Creation ends when pride begins. But when creation begins in humility, it never ends. Outside the window, the world glows with morning. The first rays of sunlight reach the candle, merging their warmth. The flame flickers once, twice, then steadies, brighter than before. The screen begins to fade. The voice softens in a final prayer. May all who see remember. May all who remember create. May all who create give thanks. The last image is of light itself, infinite and borderless. The title dissolves gently across it. The 100 Years' War, a requiem for time. No creditroi, no applausbrax, only silence. The sacred silence that comes when truth has spoken and the soul understands. When the final candle fades and the cathedral of your film falls into silence, another light awakens, the pale glow of screen. It is here, in the quiet hum of servers and circuits, that the story lives again. The centuries have not ended. They have only changed their language. The swords of the past have become keyboards. The banners of nations have become data streams. And memory itself now travels at the speed of light. Yet beneath this vast machinery, the same human heart beats, hungry for meaning. We who live in the age of information are surrounded by abundance, but starve for truth. Every day, billions of voices echo across a digital sky, yet few pause to listen. The 100 Years' War once taught us that pride and ignorance can turn faith into fire. And here we are again, wielding words like weapons, forgetting that language too can wound. In the quiet between uploads and updates, history whispers. Have you learned? As a creator, you are both the heir and the guardian of memory. Your craft must resist the erosion of attention. The algorithm hungers for novelty, but you must feed the soul. When you share a fragment of the past, you are not chasing clicks. You are reopening graves of wisdom. Each video, each image, each voiceover becomes a vessel of continuity. You carry the same torch once held by chroniclers in candlelit rooms. They wrote with ink, you write with light. The responsibility is identical. Technology, for all its noise, is also the new monastery of the world, a place where billions gather to seek knowledge, meaning, and connection. But without reverence, it becomes chaos. The digital age demands creators who remember the sanctity of truth. The historian's heart must now live inside the machine, beating gently, reminding it that data without soul is only dust. Thus, the echo of the 100 Years' War does not end in 1453. It hums through every network and satellite, reminding humanity that the tools may change, but the choices do not. Whether to build bridges of understanding or walls of pride. The war of ideas continues, and the victory still belongs to those who remember compassion that I end this strange and wondrous century. Creation itself has multiplied. Machines can now paint, write, compose, even speak with borrowed empathy. The line between maker and made blurs. Yet the question remains the same that haunted every artist since the dawn of time. What is real? Artificial intelligence has no childhood, no memory of fear or tenderness, yet it can echo the shape of our dreams. It can resurrect forgotten voices, reconstruct lost languages, rebuild destroyed cities in pixels of perfect light. And still, the soul hungers for something more, for the imperfection that proves existence. It is in the crack of a singer's voice, the trembling hesitation of a poet, the human heartbeat that no code can simulate completely. To the modern storyteller, The challenge is not competition with technology, but communion. Let the algorithm handle the noise so that you may amplify the silence. Use these tools not as masters, but as mirrors. Let them reflect humanity's vast archive of memory back upon itself. When you craft your next story, do not ask, what can AI generate? Ask instead, what can the human spirit feel that no machine can forget? In the glow of screens, your audience becomes a global cathedral. Viewers from continents apart breathe in unison for a moment, strangers united by remembrance. When your narration speaks of Joan of Arc, they do not merely see a historical figure. They feel the pulse of conviction within themselves. That is the alchemy no technology can steal. So treat each pixel as a prayer bead, each edit as a heartbeat. The tools of the future are nothing without the tenderness of intention. Let AI become your apprentice in memory, not your replacement in meaning. History does not fear the future. It asks only that we approach it with the same humility we owe the past. Imagine, centuries from now, someone discovering your film, perhaps in a forgotten archive, perhaps in the neural memory of an intelligent network. They will not see you, but they will hear your voice across the gulf of time. They will know that in 2025, someone still cared enough to retell the story of faith and fire. In that moment, you become what every chronicler dreams to be, timeless. The modern world moves too quickly to notice its own echoes. Yet history continues to speak in every crisis, every prayer, every act of kindness that defies despair. The 100 Years' War was about crowns and battles. Yes, but beneath it lay the eternal question, what does it mean to be human when the world forgets mercy? That question has not aged a day. It lives now in digital conflict, in cultural divides, in the struggle between knowledge and noise. Your film stands as an answer, or perhaps a reminder that answers are less important than remembrance. The act of remembering itself is resistance. Each time someone watches, learns, or weeps, the ancient chain of empathy reforges itself. The candle of Rouen still burns, though now its flame is electric and global. You have just traveled through a century of triumph and tragedy, 100 years that reshaped the human story. We began with 2 crowns and 1 throne too many, and ended with 2 nations reborn. We saw kings who dreamed of empires and peasants who carried faith stronger than steel. We met Edward the Conqueror, Henry the Visionary, and Joan, the girl who turned faith into fire. We watched as the Middle Ages closed their gates and the dawn of modern Europe broke open. The longbows fell silent. The cannons thundered a new age. The world we live in today, its nations, its pride, its courage, was born on those muddy fields. The moral of this history is simple but eternal. No war truly ends until the human heart learns mercy. Glory fades, kingdoms fall, but the courage to believe, that endures forever. As you leave this story, carry its flame. Remember that every victory demands wisdom, and every nation is built on the hope of those who never gave up. History Teller YT will return with more journeys through time, more voices of the past, more echoes of faith, courage, and humanity. So subscribe, stay curious, and keep your heart open, because history never ends. It only waits to be told again. Until next time, may your mind seek truth, your voice keep memory, and your light never fade.